My name's Neil Dufty from Molino Stewart. I've got a background in disaster resilience planning and disaster education. My presentation is about whether your floodplain management strategy is working, and this was carried out in the Wimmera region of Western Victoria. I would like to thank my co-presenters and co-authors, Paul Fennell from Wimmera Catchment Management Authority, Jenny Kremer, Molino Stewart, Rebecca O'Rourke, Molino Stewart, and Dr. Kelsey Sanborn, also from Molino Stewart, who assisted on this project. Also like to thank the Wimmera Catchment Management Authority for their support and funding of this project. Wimmera has a floodplain management strategy. It was developed in 2017, and its main aim is to provide a regional planning document for floodplain management, and also to have a regional work program to assist with future investment priorities. But the research question for this particular project is this strategy actually working in the community? To answer that question, we, in conjunction with Wimmera Catchment Management Authority, developed a social research program, which is, we believe, quite innovative because it actually probes the complexities associated with community flood preparedness and response. It draws on a holistic way of assessing and categorising flood risks that Wimmera CMA has used, and also attempted to use a survey method which is very much based on face-to-face engagement with potential respondents. A research framework was developed, and you can see that on the screen, to look at the underlying and root causes of flood preparedness and response, to look at the preparedness and response levels, and also some possible interventions that may help manage the residual risk. We then designed survey questions which looked at the complex interrelationships between these parts of the research framework. We sampled in 6 different communities dotted across the Wimmera region of Victoria. Those 6 communities were Dimboola, Halls Gap, Horsham, Nadamuck, Rapanyup and Warwick Nabil. And each of these have different flood scenarios and characteristics. It's particularly important to note that Halls Gap and Nadamuck are actually flash flood situations, whereas the other communities have a much longer flood warning lead time. We also surveyed across the different flood risk categories which have been identified by Wimmera CMA, and you can see the matrix there to determine those flood risk categories. We were aiming to survey 800 properties. That provided a high level of statistical confidence, and we identified a series of properties that were within those different risk categories, noting that most of these, or virtually all of them, were in urban settings. We did not have the funding capabilities to look at some of the outlying properties. And here's our sampling methodology. As you can see, there was a bias towards the higher risk properties, because obviously there's more to learn from them, but we also surveyed properties right up to the PMF. It was originally planned to door knock and engage with residents in relation to the survey, but unfortunately, due to COVID-19, this was just in March of 2020 when COVID started to hit right across Australia, elsewhere in the world, that we then had to quickly change to a letterbox drop, and we did, as best we could, send notes to show that we were actually people in that situation, and try and encourage people to return the survey. And so approximately 750 surveys were distributed over 3 days. We also attempted an online survey, and that was in lieu with some of the workshops that we were going to hold around aspects of flood language and messaging. The response rates were pretty good, even though there were these restrictions in our methodology related to COVID-19 restrictions. Our highest response rate was from Nadamuck. There was a 21% overall response rate, which is a pretty good response rate, noting that other survey techniques generally are around about this same level, and even lower. The responses came in from all flood risk categories, A to E, but there was a poor response to the online survey, even though that was well marketed by Wimmera CMA over a month-long period. There were only 16 responses there compared to about 170 responses to the paper copy survey. And so what did the results show us, and particularly in relation to the floodplain risk management strategy? Firstly, it showed that many of the respondents, in fact 60%, had experienced the 2011 flood event, which is about a 1% AEP event in the area. However, those with no flood experience tended to grossly underestimate or overestimate their flood risk. Their responses were not in sync with the flood risk, with their flood risk categories. Many of those who experienced the 2011 floods used this as their only guide to future preparedness and response. And we call this psychological situation the prison of experience. In other words, people tend to only relate future experiences to those that they've already experienced. This, of course, is a concern for the region, because people can then only be guided by, the 2011 flood. And so a possible intervention there would be to, in this year, 2021, hold a 10-year anniversary, which really stresses the point that we all know, which is no two floods are alike. Also, in terms of risk perception, most respondents actually displayed what we call optimism bias. That's where people underestimate their property flood risk against the actual risk. And a particular concern was those in the category A, which is extreme risk, and many of these, 71%, did not perceive the flood risk to their property as high in this extreme risk category. And also worryingly, 80% of those respondents who perceived a high flood risk would not evacuate before a flood. And this harks back to that element of, you know, they got away with it last time and therefore they think they'll get away with it in future. A suggested intervention is direct face-to-face engagement, particularly for those people in Category A, to discuss flood risk, preparedness actions and response, and to really show them that, you know, floods are serious and no two floods are alike, and you can experience a flood far greater than what you experienced previously. On a very positive side, with the high levels of social capital demonstrated, and social capital is the bonds, bridges and linkages between people. Now, you'd expect these to be pretty strong in a rural area such as this, or rural and regional area such as this. However, there can be cases where people, like newcomers, are left out of those social networks, or they find quite a while or time to get involved in those social networks. So yes, this is a real attribute that the region has, that so high social capital level. And also, a lot of people we found talk about flooding. There's a high level of what we call critical awareness. Also, trust in authorities, particularly around flood warning. And this is a real benefit that should be, you know, supported and work with. And so we recommend two interventions here: further form social capital, including networks for new arrivals, and also to utilise critical awareness in flood education engagement. So for people to further discuss flooding in a well-informed way. In terms of coping appraisal, we found that there were 19% of respondents that said they required assistance during a flood. This is mainly due to older age and disability. However, only 3% rated their ability to cope in a flood as not good. So you expect from that many of the people that couldn't or required assistance during a flood believed that they were going to get help. The good news is that 78% of respondents said they would help others in a flood. And so in terms of an intervention, it's important to check with vulnerable people. And one way to do that, of course, is through the Council's Vulnerable Persons Register, which is required in Victoria, to see if they have support networks and can evacuate early. In terms of preparedness levels, there were low preparedness levels across the region due to previous flood experience, as discussed earlier, and only 1% of residents said they had a written emergency plan, even though the CFA and Vic SES had strongly promoted that for several years through the media and engagement processes. 72% would not carry out any pre-flood preparations like sandbagging or raising valuable items, and although 80% were aware of flood insurance products, only 59% had flood insurance, and this is much lower than the Australian average, which is in around about 90%. And so an intervention there could be further education required to promote the importance of written flood emergency plans and flood insurance, particularly in those high risk flood categories. In terms of response, only 41% said they would evacuate before a flood, and aspects such as previous flood experience, optimism, bias, trust and animal ownership appear to be important factors in willingness to evacuate. In terms of animal ownership, there was a high percentage of people that would not evacuate because of their animals, and particularly those that were in rural residential areas just around the different townships, or had multiple, animals. They believed that they would stay in place. Most respondents believe they needed less than 6 hours to evacuate. This is particularly important in Natamuck and Halls Gap, where people did need to evacuate quickly. Less important in areas that experience riverine floods, where there is, in many cases, over 24 hours flood warning lead time. Of particular concern are the risk takers that will drive through water greater than 20 centimetres and fast flowing water. And these tended to be males over the age of 40. 66% of those that would drive through floodwaters over 20 centimetres deep. And so that's a real concern, and obviously there's a need for more local communication, particularly with this group of older males, to try and encourage them, not to take risks along the local roads. We also came up with some archetypes. These are groups of people that have the same or similar psychological characteristics. And in terms of evacuation, we identified 3 different types of archetypes. Firstly, early leavers, and these tended to be young people with little or no experience of flooding, and they would tend to evacuate early. They were the help needers, and they tended to be older females. They wanted to receive help in floods. And then there were the stay putters. These tended to be older males, and they would not they would not evacuate under really any flood scenario. There were also archetypes around driving through floodwaters. There were no risk takers. These tended to be female and younger, and they wouldn't drive through floodwaters. And then there were some slight risk takers. They might drive through fairly shallow water, and they tended to be males of all ages. And then there were big risk takers, and these were these older males that I talked about earlier, and they would even drive through fast flowing waters which were greater than 20 centimetres in depth. There were also quite a few spatial differences between the towns. For example, the largest discrepancy between the perception of high risk and actual risk was in Dimboola and Halls Gap. The greatest reticence to evacuate was in Natamuck and Dimboola. And the towns where the majority of respondents do not talk about flooding were Warwick, Nabil and Horsham. These are the larger towns. And so it's important to tailor any kind of education, engagement and readiness activities very specifically to these local communities. They're quite different in their makeups and quite different in their preparedness and response to flooding. So thank you very much, and I'll take some questions. Thank you. Bye.